A young couple had met and had their first date set for a Friday night at 8 p.m. The girl didn't know the guy well enough to know that he was constantly late for everything. So when 9 o'clock came, she just figured that she had been stood up. So she took off her makeup, put on her pajamas, grabbed some junk food, and plopped down on the couch for a night of TV. The doorbell rang and it was her date. He stared at her for a second and said, "I'm almost 2 hours late and you're still not ready?" Now, most of us don't like to be late, and we certainly don't like for others to be late. If we set a time to meet someone, we try to be there on time. We expect the same of them. Now, suppose someone said they would meet us for an appointment, but they gave no clue when that time would be. In essence, Jesus tells his disciples that he will return, but he doesn't say when that will be. Our text this morning is in Matthew chapter 24, verses 36 through 51. But before we read those verses, we want to look at the setting. At the beginning of Matthew chapter 24, we read, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." It is the last week of Jesus' life, that is, before his crucifixion. Within just a few hours, he will be betrayed, arrested, and crucified. But here they are in the city. Here they are next to the temple. And the disciples marvel at the temple, at this great city. They mention something to Jesus. His reply shocks them. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. All this greatness you see is going to be utterly destroyed," Jesus said. Well, when they get to the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. And they said, "Tell us, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" The disciples ask a two-part question. It's very important to realize it's a two-part question. And yes, the first part of the question is, when will this happen? When will Jerusalem be destroyed? When will the temple be destroyed? There is a second part to the question as well. And in verses 4 through 35, Jesus answers the first part of the question. He says, "Now there will be signs of when the destruction of the temple is going to take place, when the city is going to be destroyed." He says there are going to be some false signs. Don't be misled by those, but there will be some actual signs of when this will happen. But then in verse 36, Jesus begins to answer the second question. Jack Lewis says, having dealt with the temple, Jesus now turns attention to the signs of the second coming, and in essence says, there are to be none. Read with me from Matthew chapter 24, beginning with verse 36. "No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken and the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come in an hour when you do not expect him. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household, to give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. I tell you the truth, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. And he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and an hour that he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus says, but of that day and of that hour, no one knows. He says, I don't even know. The angels don't know. I don't know when that day will be. Jesus, previous to this, in answering the first question, when will Jerusalem be destroyed, has talked about in those days. But now he says, but on that day, concerning the time of his second coming, Jesus says, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. His return will be entirely unexpected and cannot be predicted. And since we cannot foretell when Jesus will come, the only reasonable course of action is to be ready at all times. And that is what Jesus makes the case for here. He says, nobody knows when I'm going to come again. The angels don't know. I don't know. Only the Father knows. Now, there have been many who've tried to predict when Jesus is coming in. They just kind of ignore what Jesus says here and try to come up with signs of when Jesus will return. But we need to note that in chapter 24 and 25, Matthew has 5 different sayings underscoring that no one knows the time of the coming. Leon Morris said, if people knew just exactly when the coming would take place, they would delay preparations until just before the time. And isn't that just the way we are? We procrastinate on everything. And if we knew when Jesus would come again, we said, well, I can live in sin until such and such a day, and then I'll clean up my act. Well, Jesus, in this text, makes 3 connected points. As we pointed out, he says the time of the second coming is unknown. And he says, because of that, it will catch people unawares. And because of that, the disciples must always be ready. Jesus gives the example of Noah, the days of Noah, 37 through 39. Now, we read that Noah preached for quite a number of years while he was building the ark, telling the people to straighten out their lives. He had no converts. God had the day set for the flood. The animals were taken into the ark. All the provisions were taken into the ark. Noah and his family went in the ark. The door was shut. It was then that the rain began. And as the rain continued, then it got the people's attention. But the rain came unexpectedly at a time they didn't know. And despite Noah's preaching, they had just been living life like they did every day. And the things they were doing weren't bad in themselves. It was quite all right to eat. It was quite all right to drink. It was quite all right to marry, to give in marriage. Their mistake was they didn't pay attention. And when the flood came, it came without warning, and they were unprepared. Next, Jesus gives a very brief example of the 2 men in the field working. One is taken, one is left. 2 women are grinding at the mill. One is taken, one is left. What is the point of this statement? It has been terribly misused. The simple point is there will be a sudden separation of people. The late Stafford North wrote on this text, the point here is that the moment is so sudden that there is no running. There is no question now about going back to the house to get a coat. This event happens instantaneously. Since the judgment scene which follows in the next chapter describes a separation of sheep on the right and goats on the left, two who have different destinies are described as taken and left. We should not, therefore, use this description to signify that those taken will go to heaven while those left will spend eternity on earth. Nor can this taking refer to a sudden transfer of Christians into heaven, the rapture, 7 years before Christ's second coming, as some suggest. This view ignores that this taking is said to occur at the coming of the Son of Man, not 7 years before, and the judgment follows immediately after this taking. Jesus is saying quite simply, there will be people who are doing the same thing. One will be taken, one will be left, a sudden separation. N.T. Wright said, there is no hint here of a rapture, a sudden supernatural event which would remove individuals from terra firma. Such an idea would look as odd to a first century reader as a Cadillac in a camel train. Well, we've been preaching on the parables these last few Sundays, and we are still preaching on the parables. We come to what France called a mini parable. It's about a householder. This householder, Jesus says, if he knew that a thief was going to break in, would basically keep watch. He would not let his house be broken into. That word broken into there is interesting. It means literally to dig through. Houses at that time in that place were made out of mud walls. But here's a very obvious thing, isn't it? Do thieves ever call ahead and say, would it be convenient if I broke into your house on October 17th at 10 p.m.? No. That would definitely ruin the element of surprise. They would be at a disadvantage. The person in the house would watch for them and keep them from robbing him. Jesus says, in the same way, you must be ready. The Son of Man will come in an hour when you do not expect it. Later on in Scripture, the coming of Jesus will be described again as a thief in the night. And then we come to the main parable of our particular text. And this is the first of a series of parables that deal with the second coming of Jesus. It's been called the parable of the faithful and unfaithful servants. It's also been called the parable of the slaves left in charge. And here we have the scenario. The faithful servant is said to be one who, when his master leaves to go on the journey, he does his work. He doesn't know when the master's coming back, but he has a job to do, and he does that job. But Jesus says, but suppose that servant, or it could be another servant, but suppose the servant is wicked. He says, well, the master isn't coming back for a long time, and he just is going to do what he wants to do. He's going to neglect his work, his duties. In fact, he is going to mistreat his fellow slaves, and he's going to engage in drunken behavior. Craig Bloomberg said the problem in the parable is not that the master was gone too long, but that he came back too soon and caught the servant unprepared. You see, that's the way it goes. If you have a job, you know what your job is. Your master in the parable, say your boss in modern times, they go away. They don't tell you when they're going to come back. If you are a good servant or a good employee, you say, I got this job to do. The boss is gone, but I know the job and I'm going to do it. But a bad servant, a bad employee, says, well, I can take care of this later. He's not going to come back for quite a while. I've got time. And so he neglects the work he knows he's supposed to do. It is the bad servant who isn't ready when the master or in modern times, the boss comes back. William Barclay said, "The spirit which leads to disaster is the spirit which says there is plenty of time. It is the comfortable delusion of the servant that he will have plenty of time to put things to rights before his master returns." R.T. France says, "It is only the irresponsible who need worry about the parousia, that is the second coming. And yet it is precisely they who do not worry about it and will suffer as a result." Having a sign would be the easy way out. A sign for Jesus' second coming. That'd be the easy way out. But what God requires of his people is not a last-minute turning over of a new leaf, prompted by a warning sign, but a life of constant readiness. Jesus, in this parable, illustrates it well, doesn't he? As he always does. There is the one who is the faithful servant. It doesn't really matter to him when that second coming is going to be. It doesn't matter to him when his master is coming back. He's going to do his job. He's going to be ready. It is the wicked servant who assumes he has all kinds of time and acts badly. Sellers S. Crane wrote, "The story is about the judgment. If one is faithful in his Christian stewardship, he will be rewarded. If he is unfaithful in the stewardship assigned to him, he will be punished in that place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Faithful stewardship involves watching and praying for the Lord's return." Years ago, when 20th Century Fox advertised in the New York papers to fill a vacancy in its sales force, one applicant replied, "I'm at present selling furniture at the address below. You may judge my ability as a salesman if you will stop in to see me at any time, pretending that you are interested in buying furniture. When you come in, you can identify me by my red hair, and I will have no way of identifying you. Such salesmanship as I exhibit during your visit, therefore, will be no more than my usual workday approach, and not a special effort to impress a prospective employer." From among more than 1,500 applicants, this guy got the job. Tommy South said, "The parable applies to the faithfulness and unfaithfulness of Christ's servants today and always. And is not our problem with unfaithfulness the same as in the parable? Do we not know what we should be doing in order to be faithful to our Lord? The problem is seldom lack of information about our responsibilities. The problem is assuming there's no hurry. We must always be ready. That is the point Jesus is making. We do not know the day or the hour. Be ready. Be watchful. During one of his expeditions to the Antarctic, Sir Ernest Shackleton left some of his men on Elephant Island with the intent of returning for them and carrying them back to England. But he was delayed. By the time he could go back for them, the sea had frozen and he had no access to the island. 3 times he tried to reach them, but was prevented by the ice. Finally, on the 4th try, he broke through and found a narrow channel. Much to his surprise, he found the crewmen waiting for him, supplies packed and ready to board. They were soon on their way back to England. He asked them how they knew to be ready for him. They told him they didn't know when he would return, but they were sure that he would. So every morning, the leader rolled up his bag and packed his gear and told the crew to do the same, saying, "Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today." The crew leader did his crew a favor by keeping them prepared. Yes, there will be no signs of Jesus' second coming. Our task is to be ready when he comes.